Okay, so we saw Noah sent out a raven, and I think he got good news. I think the raven got good news. I think the raven was able to get off that boat and do what it was now designed to do. Whether it ever done that before, again, is maybe up for debate. But at this point, it's ready to consume flesh, and it got sent out and probably did just that. So it says he sent out Noah sent out a dove after he sent out the raven, and this appears to be a 7-day intervals, like he's waiting a week for each one of these events to take place. Get that from verse 10, where it says, after another 7 days, he sent the dove out again, and so it seems like he's sent the raven out, he waits 7 days, sends a dove out, we're going to talk about her in a moment, and waits another 7 days and sends her out again. Okay. So the dove is commonly used, even today, as a symbol of peace, or a dove with an olive branch. Okay, it's a symbol of peace. It's something that carries over even in the secular world. The dove and the olive branch and all that goes into that is a symbol of peace. And a dove is a very different bird than a raven. Okay, and notice even in Scripture it talks about a dove in such positive light. Like in Matthew 3, of course, the Holy Spirit descended like a dove on Jesus at his baptism. So that's a positive thing, right? The dove is descending on him, or the Spirit like a dove. And Jesus sent his disciples out with instructions to be harmless as doves in Matthew 10:16. Okay, peaceful. From this passage here in Genesis 8, a dove is nearly universally understood as a symbol of peace, right? All the way through. Just this dove with an olive branch is a symbol of peace because God is bringing peace out of the midst of his judgment. After judgment was complete, the dove is this universal symbol of peace. And the dove is again, just like the raven, was not an accidental bird choice. He may have had hundreds of different varieties of birds, of bird kinds on the ark. But the dove was specifically sent out to determine if the waters had fully receded and a fully dried ground was yet exposed. At the time, the dove had not yet found a resting place, specifically, it says in the text, for her foot. So she returned to Noah's care. And Noah puts out his hand, and the dove returns to him, and he brings her back and puts her in the safety of the ark once again. And then it says, and then this is where we get that. Then another 7 days, and Noah sent the dove back out as he did before. Okay. This time the dove returned with that freshly plucked olive leaf in her mouth, which is really great news. Okay, so this is great news. The earth is now full confirmation for Noah that the earth is being restored, and it's being restored for habitation. And new life had already come forth from a healthy olive tree, after these waters begin receded. Now, olive trees can be grown, as my research on this week, can be grown from various parts. You can take a part of an olive tree and you plant it, and it will grow. It doesn't have to be just the seed, apparently. And so some of these olive trees could have, after the flood, their various parts could have found their way to the ground, and they, or God miraculously is planting them. But anyway, they would be, a sign of restoration, a sign of prosperity or health coming back to the earth. Okay, and so olive trees can be grown in various parts as I said, from the former living trees, but they can also be grown in various soils. So it doesn't have to be in a particular orchard or something like that. It can be in very different kinds of soils. You find olive trees kind of all throughout the Holy Land, and it doesn't have to be. It's not particular to its soil. It's pretty hardy. Okay. As I understand it. Again, I am not an agriculturalist of any kind. This event is roughly 60 days after the ark came to rest, getting it 40 days. He talks about the 40 days, and then talks about these 3 sending out of birds, which was 21 days. So I'm looking at basically 61 days after the ark comes to rest, that the olive tree now is able to give a leaf to the being plucked off by the dove. All right, and so this is possible that God made mature trees. It's possible. We don't know. I didn't do any research on this. I don't know if an olive tree can grow a leaf in 21 days or 60 days. It's possible God was working very quickly to restore the earth or maybe it's just all the right conditions were just perfect and life can be resumed here through all of this. Somebody can tell me if they know more about how fast an olive tree can truly have a pluckable leaf on it after that, but it seems to me that somehow recovery is being accelerated, or certainly ideal conditions are present now to allow the olive tree to start to grow. Okay. But Noah understood, regardless of all that, Noah understood the message of the olive leaf. The waters of the flood were mostly or almost entirely dried up by this 61st day after the ark came to rest, or 110, 111 days, or 210, 211 days after the floods began. This also indicates that Noah and his family understood that, I think they now understood, yes, we are departing soon. The end is in sight. We are going to be leaving the ark soon. The dove came back with an olive branch. Okay. And then Noah waited another, but remember, the dove comes back. She comes back to him with an olive branch. There's a reason for that. We'll talk about it here in a second. But Noah waited another 7 days to send her out again, right? I'm not going to be impatient. I'm going to wait 7 more days. First time, she didn't find any place, and she came back. Second time, she found an olive branch or olive leaf, but she comes back. So he's not going to be impatient. Third time, he's going to send her out, and this time, she's not coming back. Okay? So I think it shows, again, remarkable patience of them. If they were getting, cabin fever or stir crazy or, whatever else on that ark, then they were still being patient. And I think Noah's being a good father and a good leader by making these choices to make sure that they didn't leave the ark too soon, because that could have been disastrous. So it's not clear if Noah and his family could have even exited the ark without God's assistance. Remember, he pushed the door closed. So maybe they couldn't get out of the ark unless they were willing to fall, 8 stories to the ground from the top of the ark or something. I'm not sure if they could have gotten out of the ark or not. It's just not clear in the text. But we see that Noah's going to wait 2 more months again after this event before he even takes the next step. He's very patient in all of this. So this time, coming back to the story or the account here, Noah sends the dove out the 3rd time, and she didn't return, which now indicates even more favorable conditions for the earth that Noah could not see. If you didn't know it, I didn't know it until I studied this again. Doves are notoriously clean. That's why they're considered a clean bird in the Mosaic system. They would not choose to live on muddy ground, as the commentators described. They're just not that kind of bird. If it's not dry, if it's not to their liking, they won't live on it. And so that's why it came back those 2 different times. This time, the dove not coming back is a strong indication or sign to Noah that the earth is now actually dry. If the dove's going to live out there, it must be habitable, even for her. Okay? So these are not accidental choices or just random things that Noah's doing here. It actually makes sense when we understand the animals and the conditions. So after a full year now of being inside the ark, it's over 360 days. After a full year of being inside the ark, Noah sought, here I believe from the text, 3 confirmations that his family could survive outside of the protection the ark had provided for them. Okay, confirmation number 1 that he's looking for is plant life. If there's plants growing, then they can resume agricultural activity for the food that they need. Number 2, I think a condition, I won't leave the ark unless I know the floodwaters are entirely receded. Okay, and the raven and the dove are intended to bring back that kind of information. And 3, the land was dry enough to walk about and to conduct life upon, which I think the dove not returning was a strong indicator that this 3rd condition had also been met. Then it says Noah removed the covering of the ark, and if you're thinking carefully back, there was no covering ever described or discussed back in chapter 6 or 7. We don't know what it is. It's a different word. It's not pitch. It's not the word where God tells Noah to cover it inside and out with pitch. That wasn't pitch. This is a covering. You and I would think it's a tarp. Like we went to Home Depot and we bought a tarp and we covered the whole thing. And now we're going to take the tarp down because the rain stopped. I don't know what it was, but it could have been animal skins, it could have been palm branches, it could have been, I don't know, whatever kind of materials they could sew together, or maybe it was wood. But it says he removed the covering of the ark, and we just don't really know. I certainly don't know how to envision what that might have been, because that's the only time that that's described in Scripture. But it's so it's unclear what it was doing or how it functioned. But I think it's clear that it did restrict Noah's access to view the outside world. Like, he could release the raven, he could release the dove, maybe he could see mountaintops. But until he knew all of that the waters were truly gone and he was no more threat to flooding inside the ark, he takes this covering off. And so removing the covering now allows Noah the first opportunity in over a year, I think, to have visual confirmation that the waters of the flood had receded, so he could go and look out further, or some more profitable way. He could go look outside the ark and see, the land is dry, just like the signs had told me they were through the raven and the dove. Okay. So ultimately, as Scripture describes, the earth was fully dried by the 27th day of the second month, as I count this, 371 days after Noah entered the ark. So on our 365-day calendars, just a few days over a full year. On a 360-day calendar, which I think they were using, you're talking about a full year and 17 days that they were inside, that they were inside the ark, waiting for the floodwaters to come and go. But now this is the first time, it seems like, probably, only recorded, that Noah's now heard God speaking to him again. Like, he heard him go in the ark, they closed the door, it's been a year, now he hasn't heard from God since, at least according to Scripture, and now he's going to hear the actual voice of God, or hear the actual instructions of God to leave the ark. So Noah heard from God, again, after a full year, and God told Noah that he and his family had to leave the ark. They couldn't stay. They couldn't say, we really got pretty comfortable here. Get out of the ark, go. It's time to repopulate the earth and resume life on the earth outside of the protection the ark had provided. So their temporary home, this ark, could no longer be used as a dwelling place. If the mountains were anywhere close to the height they are now, the air would have been so thin it would have been very challenging if those mountains are rising, and they probably needed to descend into a better climate and certainly a lower atmosphere if the mountains were finished rising at this point. I'm not sure that they were. They also had to unload and set free all of the animals that were on board the ark. And I don't know if the animals wanted to stay or wanted to go. I don't know. But they had to make sure that the animals left the ark so that the whole earth could be repopulated by every kind that had been represented and preserved by God through this whole process. So Noah and his family obeyed, and they re-entered the world. And as I mentioned earlier this evening, I don't think it looked anything like the world that they had left. Okay. I don't know, we'll never know until we get to heaven, and maybe not even then, what the world visually looked like from Adam to Noah. But my guess is, from Scripture, that the world is radically different when they stepped off that ark. Mountains are bigger, valleys are wider, and maybe there's some form of life springing up, but maybe not the same way. I mean, maybe, when we think about all the dinosaurs and all of the different animals and plants that would have lived before the flood, it seems to be this tropic, lush, incredible, we have these massive, sauropods that are, all vegetable eaters. The world had to have been filled with more than enough ample kind of vegetation for man and animals to consume. And so it's probably really lush and just all taken care of. They may have stepped off the ark and went, there's not a lot of food out here. And then we're going to see in chapter 9, God says, well, okay, but it's okay to eat animals now. Before, you couldn't eat. All you could eat was vegetation. Now you're going to be able to eat animals, and there's going to be enmity between you. We'll see that in chapter 9 next week. But everything probably looked and seemed very, very different. So Noah and his family had to adapt to a very different lifestyle after the flood than whatever they were living in before. Although all the wickedness and sin that got judged, at least that was mostly gone, except in whatever they brought in their own hearts to this new world. Okay. All right, so that covers that whole section there of, we saw in chapter 6 the command to build the ark, chapter 7 the floodwaters come, chapter 8 the floodwaters reach their peak and they start to recede all the way down to the point where the floodwaters have ceased. Okay, so the last 3 verses here in chapter 8. Then Noah built an ark. I'm trying to make sure. Yeah, Noah built an ark to the Lord. Altar. Why did I keep saying ark? I knew it was wrong. I just couldn't get there. Noah built an altar to the Lord, or to Yahweh, and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered the burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma. Then Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, nor will I again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, day and night shall not cease. So let's look at this last section here. There's some good stuff here. Noah built an altar for Yahweh to make sacrifices on. Now this is the first reference to a sacrifice, an altar, since Abel's sacrifice back in chapter 4. Okay, we haven't seen that happen, but we saw that 1,656 years of history to get us to this point. But here we're going to see that animal sacrifices, like Cain failed to offer, Abel did offer, and now Noah is doing again. That's exactly why God gave him 7 of the clean animals, because there was going to be a sacrifice required at the end of this event. And Noah is faithful to do that. Okay. So Noah took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered them as a burnt offering. This again reminds us that the idea, the classification of clean and unclean were happening well before Moses, well before the giving of the law. And since clean is typically noted for animals like cattle and sheep and goats and few specific birds, this may not have been a huge thing. Like, people keep saying, well, how did Noah fit all those millions of animals on the ark? And now my next question is, how is Noah going to sacrifice 1 million animals on this altar, right? No, first off, it's kinds, not species. And secondarily, here now, he built an altar to sacrifice clean animals. It may have been, maybe, I don't know, I was trying to figure this out and just couldn't get any closer to a real no. Clean cattle, a couple different varieties of clean cattle, certainly not horses and giraffes and zebras and things like that. Just cattle and sheep and goats and things like that, and some birds that would fit, just like same with what we see in the law of Moses. But I would think the vast majority of these, and I'm sure Answers in Genesis or whoever has better answers than I do, but the vast majority of the animals on the ark were probably unclean, and therefore there were only 2 by 2 of them. And then you have the clean animals, and you have some of them. But I don't think Noah spent day after day after day trying to sacrifice every single, clean animal. I think it was probably a fairly limited number, because there's a fairly limited number of clean animals overall. So again, that's another one of those things. If you come up with a better answer than I can give you, then let me know what it is, because I don't know. I don't know the exact number. I'm not sure anybody knows the exact number, but probably not an all-day or multiple-day kind of event. He probably had it done in a few hours, would be my guess. Noah's sacrifice did not prevent those animal kinds from reproducing, of course, because God gave many extras compared to the unclean varieties, right? 2 by 2 of unclean, 7 or even 14 possibly of the clean. So he had plenty of animals to sacrifice, and then they could still go out and repopulate the earth as clean animals. And here we see that Yahweh was well pleased with Noah's sacrifice. it became a soothing aroma as Noah had continued to live a life of righteousness to God. So God was, if we go back to chapter 6, God was obviously very distraught, if you will, in a divine sense, over all the wickedness and sin and evil that was continuously, corrupting the earth. And he brought judgment, but, remember, he was just grieved, grieved that he made man, and now he has to destroy him, and all that kind of, again, anthropomorphic kind of feelings that God expresses for us. But here, after that, so here's Noah in the ark, and he's surviving, and, doesn't tell us his attitude or his demeanor in the ark. But here, after a year's time, Noah's able to come out, and he offers a sacrifice. And no, God doesn't, I don't think, has any kind of direct pleasure in the death of animals and the sacrifice of animals. But he does greatly desire to see a righteous man do righteous things. And here Noah sacrifices animals. And Noah's righteousness, his sacrificing of these clean animals that were bred and brought to the ark specifically for that purpose, became a soothing aroma to God. It's like, I'm not trying to put words or thoughts in God's mind, but it's like it felt like, I can let mankind repopulate the earth now, right? There's this sacrifice. I feel satisfied. It's soothing to me that Noah is so faithful and righteous that he's willing to build an ark and to keep everything alive on the earth for a full year, and then to make sacrifices. So God is expressing approval and even enjoyment of how Noah is responding after the flood and after coming out of the ark and all of this. So upon smelling the soothing aroma, Yahweh said in his heart, again, I'll go back to anthropomorphic, if I can spit it out, again, putting human qualities on something that's not human, like God, of course, or anything else, either animate or inanimate objects. Meaning, God says in his heart, I don't think God has a beating heart in his chest, right, that he would never again curse the ground for man's sake. Never going to bring this global flood. That he's specifically going to say, I'm never going to flood the earth again in chapter 9. Right now, he's just saying, I'm never going to curse the ground for man's sake. In other words, he's making a declaration, I will be very long-suffering with man going forward. He was long-suffering for 1,656 years the first time. Now he's kind of making a redoubled commitment to very, very much endure with mankind, even though we're wicked, even though we're sinful, even though the thoughts and intents of our heart are only wicked all the time. He's going to endure with us longer than he did the first time. But enduring longer doesn't mean enduring forever. He's still going to bring judgment. The second time is not by water, but by fire, right? And Christ judging the world himself directly. But he soothed his need for justice, his need to bring about judgment on man is soothed by Noah's righteous act. Now, the flood was not a cure for evil. He even says this here. It wasn't a cure. Even though the imagination of man's heart is evil, even from his youth, his adolescence, right? You don't have to train a child how to sin. We learn it. We learn it from the fact that we are just sinners, right? In fact, we just do it because we're sinners. So even from our youth, we are imagination of our hearts is to do wicked things. But God is promising here, and this is an important promise, because he just destroyed everything except 8 people and 2 of every kind, or 7 of every clean, right? He just destroyed everything on the earth practically. And now he's saying, look, I'm going to suffer long, and I am not, even though man really hasn't changed characteristically, or the ontological nature of man is still wicked and sinful, he's going to endure. This is a promise that he's making. And it's lasted for 4,400 years. So he's obviously, as it always is, being true to his word. Because God does not change. We know that from Scripture. But he does choose to refrain from repeating the same catastrophic judgment on the earth. Okay, so he's refraining from that. He could, wake up today, as though he wakes up, and say, I'm sick of these human beings and their sin again, and I'm going to do the same thing I did for Noah. I'm going to destroy the earth. But no, he's refraining from that because he made a promise, and because he is indeed a God who is long-suffering with human wickedness and sin. So his long-suffering to relent from judgment will not last forever, though. He will bring a different form of judgment the next time, and 2 Peter 3 tells us that he will consume the world with fire in the coming judgment that may or may not be all that far away. So then God promised, in this case, he's speaking to himself. He's not really speaking to Noah at this point. He's promising himself, or promising within the Godhead, that in his heart he will never again destroy the earth, especially that meaning of a global flood. Again, in chapter 9, verse 11, he's going to specifically say, I won't destroy the earth by a flood. When we get there, we'll talk about how, well, that if it really was a regional or local flood, then God has broken his promise thousands of times, because in the last 6,000 years, there's been plenty of floods that have done damage. The only promise he hasn't broken, or the promise that he hasn't broken, of course, is that he's never brought global flood to the earth again. And he's kept his word, as he always does. So at this promise, or this kind of like poem at the end of chapter 8, carries a multitude of blessings to all people, not just righteous people, not just Noah's family. Well, we're all Noah's family, but a multitude of blessings to all people living on the earth, really all the way from Noah to us, while the earth remains. Now, that's not a promise that says that the earth will remain forever. It says while the earth remains, you don't have to worry when the rain clouds come over or when water starts percolating up from the ground somewhere, that God is acting again in this judgment way. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, year by year, agricultural season after agricultural season, whether it's cold or whether it's hot, whether it's summer or winter or any other season, whether it's day or night, these things will continue as long as the earth is here. Meaning there's only, really is a statement that there's only going to be one more judgment of the earth to come. And until that judgment comes, and it will be, when God's long suffering has fully run its course, and he's given everybody the full opportunity to come to him in faith, then, in the meantime, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Whether you're righteous or you're not righteous, if you plant, you're probably going to get crops. If you work, you're probably going to be able to feed yourself. It's all going to work out because God isn't judging those things specifically. Now, of course, he does bring catastrophic judgment on certain people, Nadab and Abihu, or Ananias and Sapphira, or whatever, kind of instantaneous judgment. But for most of us, if we're wicked, we still breathe air and we still eat food, and we're still able to survive. If we're righteous, it's even better. But God is not going to bring judgment on the earth until the time that he has appointed for it to happen. And we see all that stuff in the New Testament. All right, the earth will not remain forever. I'm going to say that over and over again because it's true. It's not going to remain forever. But his blessings will be present even though man is evil and wicked. He prefers us not to be. He calls us not to be. He convicts us. The Holy Spirit was sent, right, to judge the world of sin, righteousness, and judgment. And so he wants us to be right, but he's not going to judge the whole world because certain segments of the world, major segments of the world, are still evil and wicked. So while this verse here, 8:22, does not promise that local floods or temporary famines will not occur, it does serve as a promise that all is not lost for mankind until God returns at the end of the age again. So note how Noah is, switching gears a little bit here, note that Noah is serving as a high priest before God. And he's typologically, in offering these clean animals on the altar that he built, he's typologically similar to Jesus. Okay, here's one man acting alone. None, his sons and daughters, or sons-in-laws and all that, our daughters-in-law, are not participating with him or described as being there with him. Noah is making this sacrifice on this altar that he built. One man acting alone to bring satisfaction to God's holy and righteous conduct, effectively sacrificing many through him. Right? He didn't just make one animal sacrifice. He sacrificed of all the clean animals on the earth. And so it's somewhat typologically, he's acting like Christ. This is kind of a typological of Christ. One man making a sacrifice that impacts a multitude and God is well pleased with the result. Okay? So Noah is a high priest or a priest in this role, like Christ is our high priest and the one who made his sacrifice that God is perfectly satisfied with for all times. All right. So we will. Listen, I've got some graphics to show you here at the end here, but let's just talk about this. So we're going to finish off this whole section here about the evidences for a global flood. As Answers in Genesis and Ken Ham has said for quite some number of years, if there really was a global flood, what would you expect to find in the geological record? Probably billions of dead things buried down in the rock layers that were clearly laid down by water, and it should be evident all over the earth. In fact, Buddy Davis, who is a artist, he's both a musician and an artist. If you end up going to Creation Museum or Ark Encounter, most all of the sculptures and dinosaur stuff and all that were made by Buddy Davis. Anyway, he made a song about this very thing, and I'm probably terrible at singing it, but if I sing it, it'll get stuck in your head. But I'll do it for a second anyway, even though I'm terrible at singing it, and it's going to get stuck in your head. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth, right? But then he created this song out of that, and it's just but because it's true, it's so important to recognize that it's exactly what we'd expect to find. And no, we haven't done archaeology and paleontology and all that stuff for eons. We've only done it fairly recently in the sciences. But when we go and do these things, what do we find? Really, literally, billions of things, life forms, buried deep in the rock, and they're in layers. And it's obvious that these layers have been laid down by catastrophic levels of water, and it's all over the earth. Okay? So we see fossils. Well, the best explanation for fossils is the global flood. Okay? And it really is, because if an animal or a human or anything else goes out in the desert today or forest or wherever and dies, it's not going to fossilize. It only fossilizes under very specific, rare, catastrophic conditions, and those conditions would be identical to what we would expect to see with a global flood. So let me give you some examples, and then I'll show you some pictures. Clams found in clusters of millions or billions of them buried together. Now, they don't habitate together alive. They find their own little spot in the seafloor, and they do their thing, their clammy thing. And what we found is they're all clustered together, which is unnatural for them to all be clustered together. And, that when a clam dies, it opens up. It releases its muscle, right? And it's just open. Well, they're clamped shut, like the muscle is still hard shut. So it died alive, meaning it did not release the muscle that keeps the clamshells together. Okay. And a clam, if we're talking about a really slow, gradual processes, a clam would always rise to the surface. They're very mobile. They can get up to the top and get themselves right at that right level at the sea level, at the ocean floor, and they can live. It would take incredibly catastrophic levels of layering for a clam to die of unnatural causes, if you will, right? Not of its own old age, but because it died. Fish fossils, we'll see this in a minute. One fish swallowing another fish, and it's fossilized in that very act. An ichthyosaur fossilized while giving birth. I'll show you a picture of that. Marine fossils found on Mount Everest. Lots of them, lots and lots of them. And of course, secular scientists will always come up with a rescuing device to explain why any of these things could happen. But is that the best explanation? Probably not. Anybody with any kind of just general abilities to think would probably say the global flood seems to be a better explanation than some contrived, contorted way of thinking about things. The Grand Canyon, we'll talk about bent or warped rocks. Flood legends, I'll talk about that in a second, and then Y chromosome trace. So these are all the stuff I want to show you here. So here's a clam on the left side over here, right? And it may not look like a lot to you, but it's clearly fossilized and it's closed. Okay, the muscle, it was never released at death. Okay, it fossilized. It means it happened very, very rapidly. And like I said, they found millions, possibly even billions of them, all clustered together where they don't naturally live in that kind of environment. They were all sort of swept up, deposited, and fossilized in a very, very, very short period of time. Okay. Here's a fish eating a fish, and it's been fossilized. It didn't even finish closing its mouth before the fossilization process began. That's fast, right? Oh, no. Oh, yeah, I put this in the middle. I shouldn't have. This is a proselyte fossil. I mentioned this a week or two ago, I think. So I've seen better pictures, but I couldn't find a better picture as I grabbed one from the internet, right? So this is a tree, and these are rock layers. Now, they find these trees all over the place. Sometimes they're upside down. The roots are at the top, not the bottom. Okay? So it was dead when it got encapsulated by layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of rock. Now, how does that happen? Rock is hard. Wood is hard, but it can't penetrate through rock, right? So how do you get rock forming around a tree stump? You got a tree stump. Now, if you'll look at like pictures of Mount St. Helens, when it blew, you got Spirit Lake filled with trees that have been stripped and logged and they're just floating, right? Well, then they, the process here, they go down or up or down or whatever, and then you get fossilized. It gets fossilized and it gets encapsulated by not just rock, but layers of distinct different rocks. And that you can find these all over the earth. How do naturalistic processes explain that? The flood is a great explanation. The tree got trapped, and then flood deposit layer number 1, flood deposit layer number 2, flood deposit layer number 3, in the course of a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, and then it all hardens, and then you get something like that. Here's an ichthyosaur. I don't know if you can tell, but here it is giving live birth, and it's fossilized right as the newborn comes. That's fast. That's a fast, catastrophic kind of process. Here's some fossils, obviously marine fossils found on top of Mount Everest. Okay? And it's not just like somebody dropped it there, or they find them all the time. They can find these fossils all the time up here on the highest mountains. Now everybody thinks that the mountains rose, but think about from a perspective of an old Earth, Big Bang and evolutionary thought process. Which came first, the mountains or the creatures? Mountains come before creatures. So what process brought a whole bunch of marine life on top of the mountain, and what process then fossilized them on the mountain? How do you get those? Okay, so both fish and nautiluses or whatever that might be. And as Kirk mentioned earlier, if you haven't seen these two movies, I highly recommend them. Documentaries. So is Genesis History? It's been out for about 5 years, I think. I'm not sure, somewhere in there. And it walks through, and you see all kinds of geologists and other kinds of scientific disciplines talking about how the best interpretation of the evidence that we see in the multitude and the multidiscipline areas that we look at, Genesis is history. And even if you're talking about the language of Genesis, a day means a day. 6 days, in 6 days, it means a day. And this one just came out within the last few months. It's the same thing. It's Genesis history, but it's mountains after the flood. And this one's more technical. I mean, you really it's not as like, ooh, it's flashy. They're walking you through the entire process of seeing how they are scientifically hypothesizing that the earth is young and the global flood is responsible for things like folded rocks. And then they walk you through the entire process and say, our predictions were confirmed, our hypothesis was confirmed by the way we've done the evidence. And then they talk about how secular scientists will just ignore it. They just won't even talk about it. Okay, so I highly recommend those things. A couple more things. Grand Canyon, you don't have to be, and you'll see this in any of those movies, but you don't have to be a scientist or a geologist or anything else. Notice that these are very distinct layers. And not only are they very distinct layers, they are like there's no erosion between the layers, right? And the way they describe it, like Steve Austin in the movie or whatever, it's like a pancake. Like you pour out pancake batter, it hardens. You pour out some more pancake batter, and it hardens. It has to be, if there's no erosion layers between these massive, depositions, then it has to be a very, very short period of time between them. We know that whether it's water or animals or wind or anything else, there would be erosion between these layers. The Grand Canyon is incredible evidence of a global flood. Not only that, and I think the next one may be a better picture, we see the Grand Canyon here. Now, you can hypothesize that the Colorado River, which has to flow uphill to start carving downhill in order to make this work, could carve it. But how does water carving this explain the layers? Right, the layers, you still have to explain the layers, even if the way the canyon was formed was slow, gradual water over time. How do you explain the layers? The different strata of rock formations there, especially when there's virtually no erosion between the boundaries or in the boundary between the layers. Okay, and so what's the best explanation for this? You got two choices. A little water and billions of years, or a lot of water and a few days, or 150 days, or something along those lines, right? It's the better explanation. You've got, not only do you have the canyons being formed by probably, what I've seen in Genesis, the mountains after the flood, I think they're hypothesizing there once was a great big lake here on top of North America after the flood. Okay, these layers were obviously deposited, and then one of those dams or natural dams broke, and that massive amount of water just carved the entire Grand Canyon almost instantaneously. Okay, and that seems to be the best explanation for the Grand Canyon. And again, the global flood seems to it's just natural. It makes sense that has to be the result of something incredibly powerful, incredibly catastrophic, and because of the way the layers are formed, it has to be very quick. Nothing else makes sense. Here's some folded or bent rocks. Anybody ever try to bend a rock? How do rocks? You see layers, right? So there's not one rock, not one deposition. These are layers of rocks, and they're all bent. So how do you take layers of deposition and bend hard rocks? Well, you don't bend hard rocks, you bend soft rocks. And they all had to bend soft at the same time in order for them to then form into folds or, well, okay. And then a couple more things as we close out here. There's a book here I picked up. This is called Echoes of Ararat. And this is of only North and South America, over 300 flood legends in all of the ancient cultures or the cultures that have been here. They all have some kind of an account. Usually the accounts are something like there was a guy and his family that God saved, and it was associated with being on a boat and water, and none of them are the same, but they're all very, very similar in the sense of they have a core. What that tells most people who look at it and say, there once was a fact, and it got told over time, and this culture thought it meant this, and this culture thought the story was like this, and over time, you get just in North and South America over 300 flood legends. There's plenty more in the other regions of the world. Hundreds of, over 500 or 600 legends at least, as far as I know, of similar accounts. A man builds a boat and he saves all the animals of the world, he and his family, and they do this and they do that, and it's all very similar. It means that somewhere in the midst of it, all behind it, there was a fact, there was a true account. Because why would all of these different populations and different cultures invent the same story with the same core kind of details? And then lastly, I mentioned this book several times in different things, the book called Trace. Nathaniel Jeanson works at Answers in Genesis. He's using the Y chromosome, so the male inherited Y chromosome. Women don't have it, but men do. He's able to trace, he talks about it, he calls it the Rosetta Stone of human history. because it helps us to understand all of human history going back to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Every single male on the planet that they've tested goes back to, it seems, goes back to one of those three men. Okay? That you can see how it's traced all the way back to those three men that came, that repopulated the earth, and it makes it's impossible for it to be older than, let's say, 4,400 years. There's no way, for several different reasons. The population growth, for one thing, and secondarily, every single generation is passing on weaker and weaker genetic code to the next generation. And so there's errors I think it's about 10 Y chromosome errors per generation is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. But we can trace it back to three human beings, three males at about 4,400 years ago. And if the human population were 100,000 years old, like is the minimum of speculation in secular world, the rate of deterioration would have killed us off by now. So what's the best explanation of any and all these things? The Bible is true. The global flood occurred about 4,400 years ago. Whether you're talking geology, whether you're talking biology, whether you're talking astronomy, it doesn't matter. We recognize that the account of Genesis 1 is true, and we can see it with our own eyes. We can go to the Grand Canyon, or we can go in all kinds of different places, and we can see there's real, hard, observable evidence that best lines up with a global flood event, does not line up well with deep time called billions of years. It just doesn't work. So with that, I will say good evening. Yep. Thanks.